In the US, we did have the Parkland survivors. The biggest protest against gun violence in the United States was largely organized by very young people. And what you see, a recurring theme in studying youth movements, which I encountered first when I went to China in the mid-'80s, is that you'll almost always have people say, oh, well, this generation, unlike the last generation or the generation before, or often from the generation that the speaker is from, said these generation just doesn't really care about politics. I was told this in 1986 when I arrived in Shanghai. People said, you study student movements, but it's really too bad because you're not going to see any here. These students only care about perming their hair and listening to the latest music. They're not going to take to the streets. And this was the Tiananmen generation.
This is the Rhyme and Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa just before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015.
And I'm Maria Repnikova. My Jewish Belarusian grandmother is a Holocaust survivor. I grew up in post-Soviet Latvia and immigrated to the US with my mom and brother as a teenager. I have studied China and Russia for nearly 2 decades and have been living in Atlanta, Georgia, where I teach since 2016. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to historian and sinologist Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He is the Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, and the author of many books, including the Oxford Illustrated History of Modern China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, and most recently, the Milk Tea Alliance, Inside Asia's Struggle Against Autocracy and Beijing.
We're going to be talking about that book today. So, Jeff, let's jump right in. What is the Milk Tea Alliance?
So the Milk Tea Alliance is a term that I used to have more trouble explaining until Trump's presidency began, and I'll get to why that is. The Milk Tea Alliance grew out of a set of online activists in Hong Kong, Thailand, and Taiwan, and they banded together when a Thai celebrity was being criticized by nationalist bloggers and online people in the mainland for having referred or liked a social media post that referred to Hong Kong as though it were a country rather than just a part of the People's Republic of China. And there was also, this was a time when in 2020, when there had been criticism of companies, for example, showing Taiwan a different color on a map when Beijing insists that it's just part of the People's Republic of China. So there was pressure put on this Thai celebrity to apologize for supposedly hurting the feelings of the Chinese people and sort of backtracking for this very simple act of just referring to Hong Kong as if it were its own place. And there had been companies and celebrities who had apologized before when they'd been faced with that kind of pressure. So people who were sick of this in Hong Kong, Thailand, and Taiwan said, we'll just support you. You shouldn't back down. We'll support you. And they thought, what do we have in common besides being tired of this behavior by Beijing? Well, we're all from places where the iconic form of tea is a drink that you have with some kind of milk in it. There was Hong Kong milky tea, there was boba tea in Taiwan, there was Thai tea in Thailand, all sweet and with milk in them. And on the mainland, though plenty of young people drink all those things, the iconic form of tea doesn't have any milk in it. So they said, let's band together. And suddenly you were seeing memes online of cups of tea swearing allegiance to each other, Three Musketeers style. And I said this became easier to kind of explain living in the second Trump administration, because I used to find it used to seem kind of exoticizing to say, why did Beijing care so much about how geographical places were described? But now I can just say Beijing and the nationalists who went online to support him were doing the kind of move that in Trump's time is said when you refuse to call the Gulf of Mexico, what everybody around the world calls the Gulf of Mexico, insisting that you call it the Gulf of America or you would be punished. This was like around the world, Taiwan is thought of as separate from the Chinese mainland, but Beijing insists on it. So it's something that seemed very kind of exotic, but now is easier to explain, I think.
In your book, you write about meeting Tun Mint, and I might be mispronouncing the last name, a young student from Burma who came to see you when you were a professor at Indiana University in the 90s. You describe him as one of the first political exiles you met who were not Tiananmen activists. You also write that Tun is, quote, the first person I have ever met who had carried a rifle in the rainforest of an armed guerrilla unit. Could you say a little bit more about the friendship you developed with Tun over the years and during that particular period, and how it led you to study parallels and crossovers in student activism in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me early on to bring Tun in, because this is a way of explaining how the Milk Tea Alliance, this kind of sense of people around a region watching what each other were doing and seeing themselves as having parallel struggles, is something that has had a name specifically with the Milk Tea Alliance, these places supporting each other. But Tun Mint, when I talked to him about how did he as a teenager in Burma come to think about rising up against this junta that had been in power for so long. And he said one reason was simply because we knew what had happened in the Philippines. There had been people power a little bit before. And the dictatorship in the Philippines was a different kind of dictatorship than the one in Burma. But he felt he and his friends, teenagers in Yangon, felt like, hey, people there are doing something like what we want to do. They have the same kind of grievances. And this led me to think about both the way in which actions in different parts of a region influence each other. But I also became very aware through him, he was intrigued by the fact that when he came to America, Americans had all seemed to hear about Tiananmen, but they didn't know about the very similar kinds of actions that took place in Burma in 1988 with a rising and a massacre. And so I was intrigued both by the transnational side of this story, but also by the fact that there are outrages happening in many parts of the world continually, but only some of them really kind of gain traction and awareness around the world, or certainly in America.
Umbrella became a powerful symbol that traveled from Hong Kong's 2014 protests to Bangkok's 2020 demonstrations. Can you walk us through how symbols and tactics spread across these movements and what this tells us about how modern resistant movements learn from each other?
So the Umbrella movement in 2014, backing up, before it was called the Umbrella movement, it was called Occupy Central. And that idea of occupy the central district of Hong Kong is a bit like Hong Kong's Wall Street. So there was a way in which Occupy Wall Street was an inspiration for Occupy Central, which became a movement. But when people occupied that section of the central district of Hong Kong in 2014, it was also right after there had been an Occupy movement in Taiwan, in Taipei, the Sunflower Movement. So there were like some generations of Hong Kong activists who were thinking about Occupy Wall Street, but some of the younger ones were thinking about what had just happened in Taiwan. And in Taiwan, there had been a concern, there had been young people much like them. They had been concerned in Taiwan about increasing Beijing influence that might threaten their freedoms. So there's a way in which there was a learning process or borrowing from different parts of the world. When the police started using tear gas against the protesters in Hong Kong, it's rainy, so you always have an umbrella with you. So people just started using umbrellas in a very pragmatic sense to block pepper spray and then also shield themselves from tear gas. And then over time, movements, when they reach takeoff, and you can never tell what will work, but they need to have symbols, songs, slogans that really catch on. And the umbrella somehow took off as just a symbol of resistance. And here you had police with tear gas and pepper spray and young people just with an ordinary implement, and the umbrella became a symbol of protest. So Hong Kong, then they started calling this the Umbrella Movement. In 2020, when protests began in Bangkok, that I became so fascinated in watching because they rhymed so much with the protests that had been in Hong Kong throughout the 2010s. One thing that young people did there too was use umbrellas in this way. But when symbols travel from place to place, if they're going to really work in a movement, they can be picked up on from other places, but they're often localized. So some of the umbrellas in Thailand would have on them an insignia that had to do with the moment when Thailand was supposed to have moved from being an absolutist monarchy to a constitutional one in the 1930s, and that the protesters felt that had never fully taken place. So they carried an umbrella. It linked them to young people of the 21st century. When that was emblazoned with a nod back to the national history, it also connected them to generations of protesters within their own land. And I think this is something that activists, it's hard to kind of cultivate it, but often the most powerful movements are ones that can tap into something that's universal and also something that's local and specific.
Somewhere in your book, you also talk about, from my memory, something about Hong Kong activists sending umbrellas to their Thai friends. Is that true that they actually physically send them as well as gifts and kind of?
It's very similar. They sent some goggles that were used to protect your eyes from tear gas. And so once it was 2020 and Hong Kong youth were not able to go out onto the streets anymore because of the national security law pause, they said there were some friendships developed between people in Bangkok and Hong Kong. And some of the Hong Kongers sent these goggles to Bangkok saying, we can't use these in our struggle anymore, but you're in a sense carrying it on. It was like a baton passing.
Fascinating.
Then the Bangkok protesters wanted to reciprocate, but they couldn't think of anything tangible they could send to Hong Kong in the same way. But this is very fitting since we're having this conversation on June 4th, the anniversary of the 1989 massacre in Beijing. In Hong Kong on June 4th, until the national security law, Hong Kong, there would be vigils to commemorate the events in Beijing. So some of the Bangkok youth said, well, we can't send you something like the goggles, but we'll put on a vigil on our campus. We'll burn candles the way you used to, and we'll share the photos of that with you. So we'll, in a sense, be doing something that connects with what you used to do as a reciprocity for your sending us the goggles. So I find that a very sweet, very human, very gentle kind of story in a book that has a lot of tragedy and violence in it. So I really cling to that.
In the book, you also talk about the Hunger Games, specifically the three-finger salute as a symbol that was used across these protests from Thailand to Burma to Hong Kong. How significant is pop culture in shaping real-world resistance movements? And why do you think this particular symbol resonated so powerfully across different cultures?
So I think pop culture can be incredibly important. I mean, I think we rediscover it. And sometimes, of course, the pop culture of one generation can seem sort of shallow and superficial, but then over time, it gains a kind of gravitas. So, now people think of singing Blowing in the Wind in the 1960s is not thought of as, pop culture draw. It's seen as something that was fundamental to protests. And I think for each generation, some kind of connection to youth culture, to pop culture, if there's a youth movement, is important. It's important with resistance to have it be fun, to have it be something that you get out of, that you psychologically get something out of turning out. And it can seem frivolous and light, but it can also get people going. The youth in Bangkok used the Hunger Games, but perhaps even more familiar, they used Harry Potter because there were strict laws against mentioning the king in public. You could be defamed. So if you said, we're here to protest Voldemort, and the people like Voldemort, he who may not be named, that was a way of playfully making a point. But the Hunger Games is a great, for any listeners who aren't familiar with it, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how it ends because I think this is very important. The Hunger Games is about, in the novels, and then it became well-known throughout the world via the Hollywood movies as well. It's about a group of young people from different territories within an area that are all being repressed by of modern capital, where there's an autocratic government in power, but people are kind of living high on the hog. But around in these other territories, people are more suppressed. There are young people who get involved in this reality show. We don't have to worry about the details of it. But the key thing is they band together and rise up against the powers in the capital. And what's crucial is, the spoiler, is they win. And so this is like a David versus Goliath story for a young generation. And when you had people in their teens who were very familiar with this, to think about reenacting something from that. And there's a three-finger salute that's the kind of sign of resistance in it. There's also a slogan, if we burn, you burn with us. That's a kind of last-ditch effort to try to resist something. And that slogan was big in Hong Kong in 2019. The three-finger salute was used a bit in 2014 in Thailand and in Hong Kong. But in 2020 in Thailand and 2021 in Burma, it just swept through the movement. that way. And it's interesting in a lot of ways. It's a Hollywood movie, it's an American dystopian series, but only in Southeast Asia is the three-finger salute ubiquitous within protests. And only in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia is the Hunger Games a sort of key grammar for resistance. So it's a real sign of both, again, sort of localization, but also of global things.
You argue that opposition to Beijing's influence is a unifying force across these movements. And at the beginning of the podcast, you spoke in particular about how Beijing's language policing was significant in that. How has China's growing economic and military power specifically shaped the way Thailand, Hong Kong, and Burma see their struggles as interconnected?
So I think, in a way, I cheat a little bit in the book by having Hong Kong, Thailand, and Burma, the three cases. In Burma, I think I don't cheat in the sense that these are really connected and they're watching each other and there's a flow of slogans and tactics from sort of Hong Kong to Thailand and Thailand to Burma. I think of them as a kind of anti-autocratic relay race where the baton's handed off. But the Beijing focus of this is a much smaller point of concern in Burma, and it's less important in Thailand than it is in Hong Kong. It was a kind of connective thing, but it's in these places, it's more that there's a shared antipathy toward autocracy and also then a concern with what might be propping that up. And so to a greater or lesser degree, Beijing is part of the story. But in the last few years, actually, as I was writing this, it's a very short book, but it took a long time to write. In the process of writing it, the Hong Kong activists in exile from the diaspora increasingly see themselves as connected to Tibetan activists and to some extent Uyghurs in exile too. And there's a very direct notion that Beijing is the capital that is enforcing a vision of the country that's suppressing any space for kind of local difference in those three places. In Thailand, meanwhile, there's a sense in which Thailand used to be a close ally to the United States during the Cold War, but is increasingly more connected with China, the status quo elite. And so for some Thai activists, particularly the ones that I talk about the most, there really is an idea that Beijing is propping up the autocrats there in a way not of formal colonization, but of kind of dependency. And we see some examples of this, like when a group of Uyghurs that Beijing wanted sent back to China, where they would almost certainly be punished, they were seeking refuge in Thailand. And the Thai government acceded to Beijing's wishes, sending a group of them back a decade ago and then sending a group of them back just a year ago. And so these are the kinds of things that activists can point to as a sign that they have a shared concern with local bullies, but also a way in which Beijing is supporting those local bullies in a more or less direct way.
These movements are all happening, or at least for now, in the social media era, with activists sharing protest manuals and tactics online across borders. How does this digital connectivity change the nature of resistance compared to movements you studied in 1989, China, or 1988 Burma?
So I think with every new kind of media that comes on the scene, there's a tendency to sort of overstate what's new about it, if for positive ways and in negative ways. I think this changes everything either by giving new tools of resistance or new tools of control. And they usually give both. I mean, to some extent, the internet has both empowered some forms of activism and empowered some forms of surveillance and control. But then there are other ways in which, even when these new things come on the side, it doesn't change everything. And I think actually there's sometimes an overstatement of the technology. So what you often have, and this was something that came out in tracking these developments, is online connections were crucial in the Milk Tea Alliance, but so were some kinds of real world ones. The Bangkok activists I talk about the most, Netuit Chadafat reached out to Joshua Wong, who was a Hong Kong activist he felt a kind of kinship with. He reached out to Joshua online, and Joshua just kind of ignored it, perhaps because thinking somebody writing to him out of the blue might be trying to trap him or something. And Netuit was so fascinated by the connection he felt between the two of them that he went to Hong Kong. And he met up with Joshua Wong at the end of a rally and talked to him and face-to-face convinced him that Even though you're a Christian and I'm Buddhist, we both have activism related to our religion. We're both concerned about the same kinds of things. People even say we look a little bit alike. We're kind of nerdy with these glasses, and we've been student activists for so long. And they developed that kind of friendship through real life connection that complemented what was going on via virtually. So the virtual stuff is new. But if you go back, you keep finding sort of parallels to it all the way back, whether it's samizdat that are within one part of the Soviet bloc and smuggled into another, or you can go back much further, the era of the Atlantic revolutions, the 18th century. You had correspondence societies in which people struggling for revolution in one part of the Atlantic world were sending letters back and forth. These are things that are ways of sharing techniques, sharing ideas, and also expressing solidarity, making people feel that they're not isolated. So I see many things are new about this period of social media, but some things also resonate before. One of the forms of communication that was very important, Burma, I gave you that example in 88. It was very important that there was the BBC Burmese service that was sending in information in Burmese about what was happening in the Philippines. So you have these ways that there are circulations of new kinds of communication, expand the reach of things across borders, and can be important.
That's an interesting point about shortwave radio we're talking about, because I know, on the other side of things, like in the United States, a lot of right-wing, what is now all on the internet, began as these shortwave radio shows. The technology changes a lot, or not so much. But what is really interesting about these movements in your book, you focus on these very young activists like Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, Netiwitz, and Nikki Diamond. And I mean, they all began activism as teenagers. What is it about this generation, do you think, that makes them willing to take such enormous personal risks? Is this new? And how do you think they view their struggles differently than perhaps older activists might?
Yeah, I know. I love that question. And actually, there was a BBC video that I just love that was made in 2020 with Joshua Wong and a young woman in Thailand who goes by Ang, who was 16. And basically, she's looking up to Joshua Wong in this, who's like in his early 20s, like the older generation like you. There was a great deal of mutual respect. But one thing that Ang said that was really powerful in this is she talked about, and this is interesting because as somebody who works on Asia, I sometimes get really tired of these kind of stereotypes about Asian values or ideas about Asia as if there's a shared thing across it when there's so much variety and variation. But she made this comment about, like, one of the things she was proud about the protests was that surely this should dispel any lingering stereotype of people in Asia being passive. And she was very proud of it. And also, young women were very active in both the Thailand and Burma cases. And to some extent in Hong Kong as well in 2019, a lot of very young women on the front lines. But so she was saying that she was sort of very interested in what the stereotype was and the way that their activism could confound the stereotype. And there has been a bigger role of young women, which I think is quite new for these Asian countries. And it's connected to the fact that the rise of strongman rule has had this macho reinforcement of patriarchy thing. And certainly this is true with China. Some of the most interesting activism lately has been with the Me Too movement and with the Feminist Five. And so that's one thing that's new. I think young people being involved in protests, though, has a long history. Certainly, I began my career working on student movements of China in the early 20th century. And there you had these, teenagers and early 20s people who were very involved. Even in the French Revolution, largely people were in their early 20s involved. It is younger, the fact that there are these activists in there. I think the centrality or the emergence of mid-teenagers is kind of new. And it'll be interesting to watch how far it spreads. We have Greta Thunberg, who the activists in the Milk Tea Alliance are very interested in and look up to. And in the US, we did have the Parkland survivors. The biggest protest against gun violence in the United States was largely organized by very young people. And what you see, a recurring theme in studying youth movements, which I encountered first when I went to China in the mid-'80s, is that you'll almost always have people say, oh, well, this generation, unlike the last generation or the generation before, or often from the generation that the speaker is from, said this generation just doesn't really care about politics. I was told this in 1986 when I arrived in Shanghai. People said, you study student movements, but it's really too bad because you're not going to see any here. These students only care about perming their hair and listening to the latest music. They're not going to take to the streets. And this was the Tiananmen generation.
Always surprising. And yet not so surprising if you look back at history and all these young people rising up. You talked about your kind of pet peeve about homogenizing Asian culture into this one kind of big bulk that obviously needs to be differentiated. And Thailand, Hong Kong, and Burma have very different political systems and histories. So I was curious, what surprised you the most about how activists from such different contexts found common ground? And also, what are some limitations of this alliance?
Yeah, so the limitations of the alliance, I'll start with that. The limitation are it doesn't have an institutional framework. It doesn't have a kind of clear agenda. And the movements are also, do have shared concerns, shared ideals, but also very different kinds of things. But I was surprised at how the possibility to connect went outside of the things that I had been trained were the distinct regions within Asia, or also went beyond what I was trained to think of as the specific systems that were most different. So Hong Kong, China, Japan, and Korea are thought of as East Asia, Thailand and Burma, Southeast Asia. And I was trained as a China specialist, but also an East Asianist. And I just really didn't know much about Thailand or Burma until I met Tun Mint. I'd never really thought that much about Burma. And in retrospect, it's very strange because I was being trained in graduate school as somebody doing Asian student movements. I was doing Chinese student movements. And yet nobody was saying, well, look at what was happening in Thailand and Burma, because Thailand had a rising and a massacre in 1976, but I just didn't read about it. So there are certain things that parallel that I haven't really looked into it of how, I mean, some of them connect up to other parts of the world too. But a lot of these places have a lot of energy put into commemorating a moment of a rising and a massacre. And there's a lot of interest in other places that do this. And I don't think of this as necessarily a shared, distinctively Asian thing, except parts of East and Southeast Asia, there's a high priority put on education that can make students particularly powerful as political actors. And you could have some element of that shared. But I was interested in how interested in one another these activists were, even when they were very globally minded. There was still something that helped make it seem more possible that you could do something if people one or two countries over had done. And I don't think this is not unique to Asia, because it certainly was true in Eastern and Central Europe with the way things spread and in the way the Arab Spring spread from place to place within a region. But what was kind of interesting about the Asian case is these are within Asian studies seen as very different regions within Asia, whereas the Arab Spring events were in a place that was thought of as a kind of cohesive region. So the Milk Tea Alliance idea helps you think through it. It was their way of thinking through it. But also, I don't want to be too wedded to it only being places that drink milk tea that have this, because there's been a lot of interest within those places in what South Korea had done in the past when it had thrown off American-backed right-wing autocracy. And there's also now interest in what they're doing right now. If I'd finished my book a little later, I would have really wanted to include a final chapter, a hopeful chapter that focused on South Korea, which you did such a great episode with Anthony Kuhn on. But that's a case. Right after I finished the book, right after I couldn't add anything to it, there was the South Korean very short-lived martial law moment, and then the protests against it. And Netuit Chadafat the Thai activist I talked about the most, was right online expressing solidarity with the South Korean protesters, kind of welcoming them to, okay, you don't drink your tea with milk in it, but you're honorary Milk Tea Alliance members.
Yeah. Of course, Taiwan is famous for bubble tea, but I think there are a lot of Taiwanese who would take issue with your depiction of bubble tea being iconic when there's such fine green tea. One of the interesting things about that interview with Anthony Kuhn was he mentioned something that you said a couple of minutes ago about fun, because the South Koreans know how to have fun and good food at protests. Very interesting. Now, it's not just the protesters who learn from each other. Governments across the region and the world are learning from each other, repressive governments, and they have in many ways adapted their repression tactics The tanks never rolled down Central and shot people in Hong Kong. They used legal systems, they used long prison sentences and forcing people into exile, much more than street violence. How do you think authoritarian regimes have learned from each other? And how effective is this legalized form of repression?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And definitely there's been learning curve between Hong Kong and Thailand as one of the clear places. And also, I think if we're looking at sort of flows of influence around a region, I think Singapore has been influential in a lot of part of the region about a way, how do you carry out repression of certain spheres and still get accepted in a kind of global view as a kind of a part of the modern world where nobody thinks twice about having a kind of conference and things like that. Hong Kong would like to be seen in some ways a bit like Singapore there. But the specific learning of legal attacks in both Hong Kong since 2019 and Thailand recently, there have been some similar moves kind of coming up with technicalities to ban political parties rather than doing so simply saying you can't have any kind of opposition party, but also imprisoning people and giving them relatively light sentences or not these long sentences that really outrage the world, but then bringing them up on other charges while they're still behind bars so that actually you're taking them out of circulation for a long time through this kind of series of protracted legal actions that require a lot of energy to fight, but at the same time, it doesn't give you the single thing like, okay, Joshua Wong wasn't sentenced to 20 years in prison as soon as the national security law came in. He was picked up and sentenced for a small number of years, and there was a very protracted trial. So all of these things, that kind of legalistic thing. But I've been thinking about this. There definitely are ways that autocrats are drawing from the same playbook that you can see, and this doesn't limit itself to the region at all. The way of disparaging movements by presenting them as manipulated by outside forces. This has a long, long history in different parts of the world, but it's been given more kind of local spins. I think autocrats are learning from each other or maybe envying each other to have kind of methods of making criticism of them, trying to make criticism of them toxic. I've thought sometimes that Xi Jinping had a kind of lèse-majesté envy, but actually Xi Jinping, people are so worried. I mean, they're so worried about Xi Jinping. Actually, I've heard Chinese scholars from China in the West who want to be able to keep going back to China to do research, sometimes are literally saying, well, the COVID policies were unpopular and people thought it was even because of the person at the center. Or you doing things rather than trying to avoid saying Xi Jinping's name in a way that might be captured on a video that would then be used. I think there's a way in which probably Trump has that same sort of envy for that kind of structure. So I think the autocrats or strongmen are learning from each other, but also sometimes envying each other, wanting to have the kind of authority, kind of to do the kinds of things that some others, but they're also watching very carefully at who are the autocrats that are doing things that can rein in a press or can rein in a university, but aren't turned into pariahs for it. And I think this was something that the right in America was watching Orban very carefully, watching not just sort of what he was accomplishing, but how he was accomplishing it, and at the same time being seen as more a part of the European Union and sort of not being seen as a pariah.
In your book, you write, quote, after engaging with numerous Milk Tea Alliance activists, their optimism and unwavering belief in change, even if it may take a long time or require an unexpected shift in the elite, like as with Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in Moscow, or when death removes certain, quote, old men from the scene, is undeniably infectious, end of quote. And the book ends with, quote, beginnings rather than conclusions. But with many of these movements currently suppressed and their leaders imprisoned or exiled, what gives you hope about the future of democratic resistance in Asia?
That's such a great question. I mean, I'm haunted by this a bit because Rehan Assad, a very impressive Uyghur human rights lawyer, when I interviewed her, when I thought I might bring in the Uyghur diaspora more, she said at the end, like, you've asked me a bunch of questions, but can I ask you one, Professor? She said, what have you learned that could give somebody like me hope? You have these very intractable things. And I think from historical perspective, the thing is to remember, we do need to remember how many times struggles, whether it was against apartheid, whether it was in Eastern and Central Europe, how often you would have said, like, if you stop the story at a certain point, like, what were they thinking? This was never going to work. In Hungary, 56, rising, suppressed. Prague, 68, suppressed. Warsaw, 81, suppressed. Like, why would you then do that again, thinking the result would be different? But you can point to those places and the result ultimately is. Or stick with Asia. In Taiwan, it took, we're now at the 36th anniversary of Tiananmen, and you can't talk about Tiananmen. You couldn't talk about February 28 for longer than that time in Taiwan.
Just explain the date.
Oh, sorry. 228, there was basically a crackdown and imposition of martial law in Taiwan by the Nationalist Party, a one-party regime in 1947, that then, if you went forward for decades, that was something that you just couldn't talk about. The idea was that for decades, it seemed that Taiwan was simply going to continue being a one-party state until it wasn't. So I guess you can look at these cases in which things that hit real nadirs, but over the long run, you can point to things that do change. So that's one of the things that's hope. And I've been struck reading around in the literature on resistance and social movements since I finished the book by some inspiring work that's making some related points. Rebecca Solnit has a book that's just come out, No Straight Road Takes You There. And she talks about the need to think in long-term about things like struggles for change. So she talks about, I think it's take the tortoise's view rather than the mayflies, of sort of thinking of long processes. And even things that seem to have failed actually are improving. And if you go back in history, lots of movements took a very long time to bring about fruition. And if you stop the story at a different point, you would have a very different view of it. In 1968, just to give you one example of the kind of story, after the tanks rolled in to Bratislava and Prague, and there was actually a tank man photograph taken in Bratislava of a man bearing his chest in front of a tank. And that was a very iconic photo before the Tiananmen one. But anyway, in 1969, soon after that, Jan Palach self-immolates. He's a young person in Czechoslovakia who says, as a way of drawing attention to just how horrible it seems, he commits political suicide. And there were some other political suicides. And this takes the story. What a wonderful, an amazing moment. It seemed that Prague Spring was going to change things, and it definitively didn't, even to the point of this kind of suicide, which you can think about Hong Kong 2019 or Thailand at different points, or Burma. 20 years later, there are various commemorations of Jan Palach's death. The 20th anniversary one becomes a commemoration of that actually can be seen as one of the stepping stones toward the Velvet Revolution that ends up with Václav Havel in this kind of, impossible to make up a story where this absurdist playwright, daring person who writes all these kinds of things ends up being president of the country. And yet you have stories like that. And it's not surprising, I think, that for people like Netuit, Havel's a figure they like to think about, Mandela as a figure they like to think about, focusing on particularly the part of their lives that went from there's no way this is going to succeed to at least for a time succeeding in incredible ways.
So let's turn to the United States, where currently many people are feeling rather hopeless because there's been some kind of a bloodless self-coup, or at the very least a severe erosion of democratic norms and a real turn to authoritarianism. We have masked men kidnapping people off the streets and being rendered to overseas prisons with no due process. They're sending people with weapons of war to just detain restaurant workers. The courts seem powerless to stop the Trump machine from its unconstitutional behavior. Yet there have been very few protests. Have Americans lost their stomach for resistance? And is there something in the United States we can learn from the Milk Tea Alliance?
So I was trying to think of a lot about the sort of what to learn from it. One of the things is that it certainly changed the way I think about certain things, like the Hong Kong protests of 2019, the event that the book before this I wrote about was Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, for the same press that's doing this Milk Tea Alliance one. And the 2019 protests in Hong Kong were just extraordinary. They grew to a size of more than 1 million people on the streets in a polity of 7.5 million. So some of the biggest protests in the history of the world per capita. And what seemed strange about it initially was that the cause of it that time was not a call for democracy, but opposition to an extradition law, an idea that people were being taken across borders or could potentially be taken across borders for political reason and subjected to punishment in a place that had none of the kind of legal recourse that in Hong Kong, which had never been a democracy, but it had a degree of rule of law, was very different. I mean, it just seemed like a strange cause for a giant protest. Now, living through America in 2025, it doesn't seem so strange. This idea of a kind of, if certain kinds of protections of rule of law and separation of powers disappear, then how endangered we are, and even with extradition, in this case, outside of the country. So I think there's a way in which just learning to take those kinds of issues incredibly seriously. It's hard to rally around, let's start a big slogan like protect some degree of separation of powers. It doesn't sort of roll off the tongue. But I think there's a way in which the Hong Kong story, it's a cautionary tale that way. Look, in retrospect, that was something that in retrospect, it makes sense that they would see this as something to go to the wall about. So maybe that's something more to learn about taking those things very seriously. I think the South Korea case is an example of something to learn from, that the idea of just deciding that this is something that shall not happen and taking to the streets. I think the fact that the protests, as Anthony Kuhn said, there was some degree of fun and celebration. There needs to be some way of recapturing that, which there was during the Women's March right after Trump's first election.
The Women's March with the pussy hats and the general sense of carnival, there was, but there hasn't been that, has there?
Yeah.
I mean, Tesla takedowns, but they haven't been.
I mean, it's a strange thing to sort of focus on at a very dire moment, but there is an importance to that. And there's an importance to humor. There's an importance to things. I mean, we haven't seen resistance on the streets, but The Onion has had a better run for things and some other things of satire. So there's some way of balancing, because I think that the challenge of it is that humor and satire can seem like a diversion from the kind of real work of social activism, but actually at a lot of times there has to be an interplay of those kinds of things. There needs to be some element of that as well. And I think that's something that the Milk Tea Alliance has something to offer there. I don't think we should be dismissive of the way in which pop culture and things did provide a kind of galvanizing force. And I think it's really important, and this is something that I think has disturbed me in watching what's going on in the United States, along with everything else, is it's felt sometimes as though the right or the sort of supporters of the autocratic turn have been more interested in the world and looking at what they can learn from places outside of the US than the people resisting it. And I think that global learning needs to take place on the resistance side as well.
On that note, Jeff, thank you so much for joining Rhyme and Chaos.
The Rhyme and Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Rapnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymeandchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.